Hi, I'm Stephen Meurrens. I'm an immigration lawyer based in Vancouver, British Columbia, and also the co-host of the Borderlines podcast, which is a podcast dedicated to Canadian immigration, refugees, and border-related issues. I'd like to thank the Saskatchewan Open Door Society for inviting me to speak today about the history of Canadian immigration legislation in Canada. And so over the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to be providing an overview of the history of Canadian immigration law since Confederation, so since 1867. It's a bit of a daunting task, but what I hope to do is convey how Canada's immigration system has gone from being one in which eligibility was broad, so many, it didn't really matter what your occupation was. Eligibility was very broad. However, inadmissibility was also very broad. And especially at the turn of the 20th century up until World War II, inadmissibility was largely based on race. And so we went from a system where eligibility was broad, but so was inadmissibility, to one in which all races are welcome to immigrate to Canada. We don't discriminate anymore, at least explicitly, based on one's race or nationality in terms of being able to immigrate, but eligibility to immigrate has greatly, greatly narrowed. So in my office, I have art on the wall, which I'll hold up here. I guess it's going to show backwards, but it says 40,000 men needed in Western Canada to harvest 100 million bushels of grain. The price to immigrate, $12. And this art is something that I reflect on whenever I'm trying to narrow a client's employment so that it matches, one of a certain list of national occupations, and applicants have to pay thousands of dollars, meet certain education requirements. To back in the day, it was, Canada having to advertise 40,000 men needed, come one, come all, sort of, as we'll discuss. So Canada's first immigration policy following Confederation, the Immigration Act of 1869, contained very few restrictions on immigration. And Canada's first Immigration Act was actually mostly based on ensuring the safety of those arriving in Canada. The only real restriction in Section 16 of the Act was in Section 16 of the Act, which provided that the governor of Canada, could, by proclamation, prohibit the landing of pauper or destitute immigrants at its discretion. So that was it. There was a race-based component to the Immigration Act, as Section 1 provided that Canada could establish immigration offices across Canada, but then only in Britain and continental Europe. However, for the most part, the goal was to get people to come en masse if possible. After Confederation, one of Canada's main objectives was to settle the western part of the country. And historically, the United States was also expanding westward, and there was a little bit of a use it or lose it, atmosphere in Canada. So their goal was to get people to come. In 1872, Canada passed the Dominions Land Act, which provided that any settler who was 21 years or older and who paid $10 would get 160 acres of land if they lived on it and cultivated at least 30 acres of the land. So it really was pay a little bit of money, come and please settle the land. And at the turn of the 20th century, this eligibility continued to be broad. By that, I mean one's occupation or family relation was not an obstacle to overcome. However, many non-European ethnicities essentially became inadmissible from the period starting at around 1885 right up until the end of World War II. Perhaps the most famous piece of legislation was the Chinese head tax, and this was implemented through the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885. This piece of legislation imposed a $50 tax on every Chinese person who entered Canada, an amount which, through a series of amendments, would peak at $500 in 1903. There were very narrow exemptions. Certain Chinese people did not have to pay the tax, but for the most part, this act was designed to discourage Chinese immigration to Canada, which was sort of ironic, as historians will note, given that without Chinese people in Western Canada working on the railway, the ultimate settling of Western Canada may not have happened. And if anyone is ever interested in taking a road trip, there's a series of memorials and cemeteries for Chinese people who helped build the Canadian Pacific Railroad up British Columbia. And I think if you Google it, you'll find neat little routes, the road trip routes that people have taken. Anyway, so the Chinese head tax was imposed. Now, as someone who likes to comment on the unintended consequences of legislation, it's worth noting that the Chinese head tax was no exception. And the Chinese Immigration Act, which was the act that brought in the Chinese head tax, was amended to reflect this by deeming in part that any Chinese woman who married a non-Chinese man was, quote, deemed to be the same nationality as her non-Chinese husband. Just an interesting way that legislators have to deal with the unintended consequences of legislation. There was no similar provision for Chinese men who married European women. Anyway, in 1908, the Continuous Journey Regulation was enacted. And this piece of legislation provided that someone could only immigrate if they traveled directly from their home country to Canada. And this legislation was challenged, perhaps the most famous example being the Komagata-Maru incident, whereby a steamship was rented to carry people from India to British Columbia. The passengers were not allowed to disembark. There was some incidents of disobedience to try to get around this, but ultimately most of the people on the Komagata-Maru had to go back to India. Now, Canadian immigration continued to become more and more restrictive. The notion of a head tax was eventually expanded to include all immigrants in 1910, and the government that same year shielded its immigration decision makers from judicial review. So there was no access to the courts to challenge decisions. In 1911, an order in council actually even banned all Black people from immigrating to Canada for 1 year. In 1919, the prohibitions continued to expand, and any citizens from countries that fought Canada in World War I were banned from entering Canada, as were the Dubadors, Mennonites, and Hutterites. In 1923, the Chinese Immigration Act essentially prohibited Chinese immigration entirely. And according to the Pier 21 website, Pier 21 is a historic, I guess, a landmark in Nova Scotia, and they maintain a very good immigration website that also discusses a lot of immigration history. According to Pier 21, it's estimated that between 1923 and 1946, only 15 Chinese people gained entry to Canada. That's 1-5. That's how comprehensive the prohibition on Chinese immigration was. Finally, in 1931, immigration was limited to British subjects from Great Britain, the Irish Free State, Newfoundland, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and the Union of South Africa who could support themselves. The result, predictably, was that immigration to Canada plummeted, and it would not recover until the end of World War II. And it's only even in recent years that the total number of immigrants, let alone the percentage of the country that was comprised of immigrants, would even start to near what it had been before all these restrictions. So again, go to my earlier point or thesis, Eligibility was broad. There was no real restriction on what type of occupation there was or what type of occupation someone had to be in to immigrate. But who was inadmissible to Canada was pretty much everybody except white people from certain countries that were part of the British Commonwealth. World War II, there is a shift and a review. I reviewed some textbooks in preparation for this, and some of the political speeches showed that the country was frankly horrified by the excesses, to put it mildly, that racism caused during World War II, and the notion of race resulting in someone being inadmissible to Canada was no longer palpable. And the Canadian Citizenship Act of 1947 provided that people of any race explicitly could become citizens if they spoke adequate English or French, or if they lived here for 20 years. Immigrants that had served in World War I and II were eligible for citizenship after only 1 year. And what we're about to see in the next 50 years going forward is that they swing open the door after World War II, and then they start narrowing eligibility. So in 1950, the Department of Citizenship and Immigration is created. Anyone from Europe who is healthy, of good character, and had the skills needed to thrive in Canada, broadly defined, and who could integrate, could arrive. Asians could eventually apply again, as could Germans, who obviously Canada fought against in World War II. But the door is swung open, and then very quickly it starts to narrow, but this time based not on race, but eligibility. So by the 1960s, concerns emerged about a mass of unskilled immigrants arriving in Canada. And Canada introduced its first sponsored immigration program, which today can be thought of as the family class, and non-sponsored programs. So the family class was initially limited to people from Europe, the Americas, and certain Middle Eastern countries. And it was, for those racial groups, even broader than it is today. People could sponsor, in addition to spouses and kids, their fiancés, their brothers, and then parents and grandparents, which we still have. And the family class was eventually extended to include all races. In 1967, Canada, which is a milestone in Canadian immigration history, Canada introduced what I think was the world's first points-based immigration system. Immigrants who met a prescribed score could immigrate, and the score was based on things like language, occupational skills, adaptability, kind of like what we have now. At the same time, the family class was narrowed to which scope of people could immigrate. Discrimination on the basis of race was explicitly prohibited. And what starts to change from the time when they're, saying, please, anyone come, and it's hard to get people to move to Canada, was that, there's no shortage of people looking to come to Canada. And there would be no more, please come, we'll even give you, land for $10. The Department of Immigration would eventually strive towards a goal of immigration based on about 1% of the population. The absolute number of immigrants might grow, but that percentage would stay flat. And I believe Canada has only met the 1% target a few times, but that is the stated goal. And it seems to be a goal across, well, at least the two main political party lines. So now in the 21st century, we are in a world where anyone can easily apply to immigrate through the internet. And because of globalization, English is becoming more and more prevalent. I recently posted to Twitter a table which showed the top countries of who is qualifying to get invited to apply through Express Entry, which is Canada's main economic immigration system right now. And the top 3 countries are India, Nigeria. Oh, and the third one is escaping me. Oh, China. India, China, and Nigeria. And what I mean to convey is that race does not determine whether someone speaks English. pretty sure India is the largest English-speaking country in the world. And because of the internet, it's easy for someone sitting in Chandigarh to fill out online forms and apply to immigrate. Ditto in Lagos, Nigeria, or in Beijing, China. And so now Canada faces a different challenge than what it faced from before. And the demand to immigrate to Canada greatly exceeds supply, to put it bluntly. And by supply, I mean the supply of spots available, especially when you factor in the need to accommodate for family reunification, which is right now narrowed to spouses, common law partners, kids, parents, grandparents, and then in certain situations broader than that, as well as refugees. So Canada, introduced a point system in 1967 until in 2008, it started to favor Canadian work experience through the introduction of the Canadian experience class. There's still the points-based system in the federal skilled worker system. So if someone gets 67 points out of 100, they can apply to immigrate. And those who are more familiar with recent Canadian history will know that that backlog grew and grew and grew. And under Stephen Harper, the backlog was actually completely terminated. And I think it's something like 1 million federal skilled worker applicants had their applications terminated. And then the government brought in 2015, a 1,200 points ranking system that would go on top of the 1,200 point ranking system that would go on top of the 100-point ranking system. And this ranking system is known as express entry. So even if you have your Canadian work experience, even if you have more than 67 points, there's now a points-based system on top of a points-based system. And even in addition to that points-based system, many of the individuals who need to apply get more points if they have provincial nomination certificates. So now the provinces, a lot of them have their own points-based system to determine who they're going to nominate. So to immigrate now, you almost have a points-based system on top of a points-based system on top of a points-based system. There's 3 rankings, all based on narrow requirements so that only certain occupations, job offers, in some provinces it's dictated by salary almost exclusively. There's all sorts of little rankings at eligibility to try to narrow who can qualify to immigrate to Canada, because otherwise the demand is simply so great. So this is one of the big challenges right now in Canada's immigration system, is figuring out how to narrow who can qualify to immigrate in a world where everyone has easy access. Well, not everyone, but where a significant percentage of the world's population has access to the internet, and it's an increasingly educated world, and a world where more and more people speak either English or French. Now, at the same time, and compounding, and this is what I would say, the main issue in Canada's immigration system right now is the admission of permanent residents has quotas and targets. The admission of temporary residents doesn't. And there is no limit on the number of foreign workers who can come to Canada. There is no limit on the number of students. The former is determined basically by the job market and Canadian employers. The latter is determined by schools. And more people are arriving as temporary residents. In 2019, permanent residence was given to roughly 340,000 people, which is very large, largest in almost since the start of the 20th century. At the same time, though, you have the 340,000 people, over 400,000 work permits were approved and 400,000 study permits were approved. And that doesn't even include their dependents. Those are just the work permits being approved. So what you can see is more, now not all those people intend to apply for permanent residence, those who are students or workers. And so not all of them will want to stay permanently, but there is a growing number of people with temporary status who are staying here for a longer and longer period And there's this risk growing of there being a permanent temporary resident class as the just simply brought about by the fact that the government, through a quota or a cap, tries to limit the number of people who can become permanent residents. And there's no restriction on how many people can come and start up residence, start building lives here. And that's probably the biggest issue that Canada's immigration system faces right now. And it's one where, unlike with barring people from race, which is obviously wrong, there is no clear answer to what to do about the imbalance between the temporary resident population and the permanent resident population, or the number of people who can apply for permanent residence. People might have strong opinions, but I think everyone can agree that it's not as clear as the solutions to that aren't as clear as what to do about legislation which prohibits people based on their race, which is obviously to get rid of that regulation. Anyway, I feel like I'm starting to ramble, so I think I will leave it at that. We can be happy that we're no longer a country that outright excludes people from immigrating based on race. And we can also be happy that we no longer have to beg people to immigrate to Canada. But at the same time, there are serious issues that Canada and Canadians will have to determine with regards to what we will do with that imbalance between the number of people who want to be here, the number of people who are here temporarily, and the number of people that Canada admits on a permanent basis. And so with that, I will leave it at that. You can follow me on social media on Twitter at Smeurrens, Smeurrens. For our Borderlines podcast, you can Google it because I think it's only on SoundCloud. It's on all your podcast devices. If you Google Borderlines podcast, it should show up. The image is of a blue background with a little customs office. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and the rest of this symposium.